Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're undertaking a meticulous deep dive into a truly landmark 2025 Supreme Court case that has literally reshaped the landscape of Indian criminal procedure. The case is Mihir Rajesh v. State of Maharashtra and Anner. For anyone studying constitutional law or criminal practice, this is an absolute masterclass in the tension between human liberty and executive power. We're going to unpack exactly how the Supreme Court addressed a massive procedural loophole regarding how arrests are actually conducted out in the real world. Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp the mechanics of this sweeping ruling, we're going to follow the classic case brief method to build a highly organized mental map. We'll cover the facts of the case, the core legal issues, the constitutional rules and statutes, the arguments of the parties, the brand new 2-hour rule, and finally, the ultimate judgment. All right, Section 1, let's look at the facts of the case, specifically the tragic Worli hit and run. Now, every major constitutional review is triggered by human events, right? We first have to understand the factual background here. This litigation arose from a devastating traffic accident in the Worli area of Mumbai on July 7, 2024. A speeding white BMW rammed into a scooter, tragically resulting in the death of a woman. 2 days later, on July 9th, the police traced and arrested the alleged driver, the appellant, Mihir Shah. The FIR was registered under the new Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, the BNS, and the Motor Vehicles Act. But here is the absolutely crucial procedural loophole that sparked this whole legal battle. When apprehending the appellant, the police only provided oral grounds of arrest. There was zero written documentation handed to him detailing exactly why he was being stripped of his liberty. Which brings us to Section 2, the core legal issues. What exact structural questions was the court tasked with resolving? So the High Court had actually acknowledged the police's procedural lapse, but they upheld the arrest anyway because of the extreme gravity of the crime. When Shah appealed, the very first question before the Supreme Court bench was about the scope of the right to written information. You know, under specialized statutes like the PMLA, written grounds are fiercely guarded. But does this strict requirement for written documentation apply universally to general crimes under the standard penal code? Or is just an oral explanation good enough for ordinary offenses? And issue number 2 looks at the consequences of getting it wrong. What happens to the legality of a suspect's custody if law enforcement misses the deadline to provide these written grounds? Does a procedural failure completely vitiate, meaning entirely invalidate, an arrest and the magistrate's remand, even in a case involving serious factual gravity and flight risk? Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 3, the constitutional rules and statutes that govern this dispute. To answer those massive structural questions, the court had to consult the rule book. The bedrock of this case lies right in the Constitution. Article 21 dictates that any deprivation of personal liberty has to be fundamentally just, fair, and non-arbitrary. You obviously can't just lock someone up on a whim. And Article 22(1) guarantees that an arrested person must be informed of the grounds for their arrest as soon as may be. Notice the precise phrasing there. It guarantees the right to be informed, but it kind of leaves the exact method and precise timing open to interpretation. Supplementing the Constitution is the new Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita, or BNSS. Sections 47 and 48 strictly codify these constitutional duties for law enforcement officers working out in the field. They impose an absolute, strict statutory obligation on police to immediately communicate the particulars of the offense and notify a nominated relative. These statutes are essentially designed to bring the lofty ideals of Articles 21 and 22 down to the gritty reality of a street-level arrest. Let's jump into Section 4, Arguments of the Parties. It's essentially a battle of liberty versus pragmatism. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly it contrasts the two philosophies colliding in court. Mihir Shah argued for an absolute defense of fundamental rights, that written grounds are unyielding. An oral recitation just leaves an arrestee functionally blind. Without a physical piece of paper, how are you supposed to consult a lawyer or fight a remand? But in stark contrast, the state of Maharashtra argued for pragmatism. They claimed that demanding formal written documents during a volatile emergency, like a hot pursuit, severely handicaps the police. For a standard hit and run, the state argued, simply telling the suspect why they're being arrested should be more than sufficient. Which brings us to the meat of the explainer. Section 5, the 2-hour rule, and exactly how the Supreme Court reconciled these arguments. The bench started by looking incredibly closely at the text of Article 22(1), and this brilliantly illustrates the court's view. The Constitution says no person who is arrested. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say no person arrested for a white-collar crime, or no person arrested under a special statute. The phrasing is absolute. The court ruled that constitutional shields apply universally, totally regardless of the nature of the crime. So, a citizen arrested for a traffic offense under the BNS has the exact same baseline procedural rights as someone arrested for complex financial fraud. Next, the court tackled the state's argument that oral communication is sufficient, and they completely dismantled it. Think about the reality of an arrest for a second. It's chaotic, it's terrifying, it's incredibly stressful. The court pointed out that oral communication in such a traumatic moment is inherently unreliable. A panicked person is definitely not going to remember a verbal list of penal codes. Plus, oral grounds just generate endless, messy, factual disputes later in court. A written document, on the other hand, creates a permanent paper trail. It protects the accused right to counsel, and honestly, it creates a protective paper trail for the police to prove they followed the law. But what about the state's valid point about fast-moving emergencies? Well, the court's solution is the newly minted 2-hour rule. So the crucial point is this specific timeline. Step 1. If immediate written service is impossible because it's a chaotic field arrest, police can initially inform the arrestee orally. Step 2. The police must then compile the formal written grounds. And Step 3. These written grounds absolutely must be served on the accused at least 2 hours before they are produced before a magistrate for a remand hearing. Why 2 hours? Because a defense lawyer needs a fair window of time. Actually, scratch that. It needs to be a functional window of time to parse the allegations and prepare. Handing a lawyer a document exactly as the hearing begins makes the constitutional right to counsel a literal dead letter. And to enforce this, the Supreme Court placed a heavy, active burden directly on subordinate magistrates. Magistrates are no longer just administrative rubber stamps for the police department. Before authorizing custody, they have to verify a strict 4-part checklist. Are the grounds explicitly in writing? Are they in a language the arrestee actually understands? Were they served 2 hours prior, and was a relative formally notified? If the police fail this checklist, the magistrate must recognize that the arrest is completely, undeniably illegal. Let's wrap this up with Section 6, the final judgment and the new national standard. This meticulous reasoning leads to a sweeping impact on Indian jurisprudence. The Supreme Court established a uniform, totally non-negotiable national mandate, providing translated, written grounds of arrest at least 2 hours prior to a remand proceeding is now a constitutional imperative across all statutes. If the authorities fail to do this, the detention is patently illegal. And crucially, an initially unconstitutional detention cannot be magically sanitized by a later remand order from a magistrate. The foundation itself is broken. So, what was the outcome for the actual litigants? Because the Supreme Court declined to enter into the specific evidentiary details of Mihir Shah's individual appeal, his ongoing custody was formally left undisturbed on the merits in this specific ruling. However, in several connected appeals where a clear procedural breach of these new guidelines was obvious, the court directed that interim bail be continued. Investigating authorities can only move for fresh remand proceedings after they strictly compile, translate, and supply the written grounds in absolute compliance with this new pan-statutory framework.